Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is our first webinar from Your Better Nature. And thank you so much for your leap of faith in being our first audience in this bold and hopefully world-changing venture. I'm Jane Moat, I'm a journalist, I'm a former BBC News editor, and I'm someone who believes that we humans can do better. I'm going to be doing my best to keep tonight on track and to make sure the right questions are asked, your questions, and hopefully to make sure that you go away with more than you expected from tonight. Now, Viv, she's the heart of Your Better Nature, and she's just going to introduce herself now.
Hello, everybody. I'm Viviane Ducy, and most of you actually know me as just Viv. We're encouraging comments throughout the session, so please put them into the chat section if you can. And when you have a question for the panelists, if you could put a Q in the front, then that would really help Jane and I to identify when we've got a question coming up. So right now, looks like today we've got something in the order of 40, maybe 50 people in this call. We've actually had bookings of about close on 90, and people are mostly in the southeast of England. But also we've got family from Norfolk and in fact from South Africa too. So welcome everybody.
Thanks, Viv. Now we're going to get started, and I'd like to introduce you to our key speakers, Paul and Tony. I took the liberty of dusting off a few of their family albums, not a popular move, I'm afraid, and looking at their CVs a bit so that we could tell you the story of how they came to be here tonight. And the first human story we're going to tell you about is Paul Hannam's. Paul Hannam grew up in Surrey, England, as an energetic youngster, a keen chess player and football fan. When he did his masters in Ottawa, Canada, his sporting interests branched out further. He went on to have a big job in IT. In fact, he had it all. But then, aged nearly 40, one book, The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, given to him by author Tom Hartman, changed his life. He read it on a plane to Los Angeles.
Reading The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight was really one of the pivotal moments of my life. It was a book that really laid out exactly what Western civilization had done to the world. Up to that moment, I thought I'd been successful. You know, I ran a large business which I set up. I employed, several hundred people. Everything was going great. But after reading that book, I realized that the very things I thought had made me successful were actually extremely bad for the planet. What had been good for my bank balance was bad for nature. What had been good for my ego was actually very bad for my soul and my deeper self. And after reading the book, I decided to completely change my life.
Tom and him became friends. He immediately stopped working in the IT industry, devoting himself to environmental causes instead. It has left him more resolute than ever to do what he can to prevent climate breakdown and ecological collapse. Paul has decades of experience in organisational psychology, leadership and personal development. He's an academic who's taught at Oxford University and has published 4 books, including a Sunday Times bestseller. The most recent, Significance, is about refocusing your life on what matters most. He's motivated by demonstrating the positive relationship between our physical, mental and spiritual well-being and a healthy ecosystem, believing that we can only flourish if nature flourishes. He met environmentalist and Sussex Wildlife Trust President Dr. Tony Whitbread in the local Greening Stenning group, and the more they talked, the more they knew they had to keep talking. The concept of interactive talks emerged to promote the vision for improving lives and our environment by following Your Better Nature. Oh, Paul, really, honestly, tell me now, could a book change your life to that degree?
I never would have believed it would be possible, Jane, but as my name suggests, I had a road to Damascus experience. In fact, I only went back into my office for one day after that. I really did change everything for me.
That's amazing. So do you think that tonight's talk and the series that you're going to do is likely to have an effect as dramatic as that on the people watching?
Well, I hope so. You know, it might be something Tony and I say, it might be a link we suggest, or a book, or an idea that people can explore more. I firmly believe all the knowledge is out there, all the tools are out there, and we just need to put those pieces together on the jigsaw.
Well, hopefully we'll start to do that tonight. And before we do that, I want to introduce our other speaker. Dr. Tony Whitbread is now in the spotlight. Tony grew up in a family of nature and outdoor enthusiasts with annual holidays on a farm in the Lake District, which he loved, although his teenage self wasn't allowed to show it. He had always been keen on wildlife, but didn't see himself as a botanist or zoologist. It was when Tony's mum, working in a local school library, brought home books and writing on ecology that things fell into place.
Ecology was a relatively unknown subject back in the 1970s when I was at school, but to me it explained how nature worked, how nature fitted together. It explained nature as a system, so that fascinated me. And later on I started a career in nature conservation, and I worked for some of the best forest ecologists in the country. I was really lucky, and that made me fascinated in forest ecology.
The 1987 storm blew him a great opportunity to research and understand natural forests in the southeast, and from that he became interested in rewilding. He's deeply involved at NEP, England's finest rewilding example, and is now helping to promote rewilding across the country. He worked for the Sussex Wildlife Trust for a total of 27 years, 12 years as CEO. Throughout, he promoted large-scale approaches to nature conservation, such as Sussex Wildlife Trust's Vision for the Wildlife of Sussex, and national initiatives like the Trust's Living Landscape theme. Since retirement, he became its president and a strong advocate for a healthy environment connected to people. He passionately believes that we can live without many things, consumer goods, holidays abroad, even an economy, but we can't live without an environment. He's teamed up with academic, author and environmentalist Paul Hannam to encourage us to reset our economic and social compasses. Working together with his wife Vivian from their home in Sussex with journalist Jane Moat, he is appealing to your better nature to help write a new human story for our times. Thanks for that, Tony. So what would you say your Eureka moment was then?
Yes, I started to read books on ecology rather than zoology or botany, and I found I was interested in systems. It was a small step then to think about, well, how the human race actually damages those systems and what we need to do about it. So yeah, it's very early for me. It was kind of a Eureka moment, I suppose, yeah.
And the foundations were laid, hopefully, for some of the things that we'll be talking about tonight and over this series. Well, we'll come back to you shortly, but I think, Paul, you're going to kick off on this subject of your human story.
Indeed. Well, behind me, you will probably see one of the most famous photographs ever taken of Earth rising, taken from Apollo 8 in December 1968. And it reminds me every day, as it's my screensaver, of the beauty, the fragility, the precious nature of the Earth that supports our life. And as we look at this photograph, we should be grateful, loving stewards, celebrating and caring for this extraordinary planet that gives us life, and maybe the only source of life in an otherwise lifeless universe. But our dominant collective culture is based on a very different worldview, a dysfunctional and toxic story, at best taking the Earth for granted, and at worst exploiting our majestic planet, leading to the destruction of our ecosystems and threatening our very survival as a species. In these webinars, we're going to look at two contrasting stories. Our current story of rampant growth, climate breakdown, and ecological collapse, and a desperately needed alternative story based on stewardship, regeneration, and equity. And whichever story triumphs will decide the future of humanity. I can't put it more starkly than this. And this is based on over 20 years of working in this field and really speaking to some of the world's top scientists and experts, going back to Tom Hartman, who we saw earlier, the book I read. So let's explore, first of all, our dominant story, the one that really prevails, particularly in the West, and that is the source of our planetary crisis. It's a story of human domination, of human exceptionalism and entitlement. It's a story of separation from nature. It's a story of human selfishness and individualism. It's a story of endless growth with no respect to planetary limits. It's a story of corporatism, of profit over people and our planet. It's a story that our main purpose in life is to consume as much as we can, and that more stuff will make us happier. And it's a story of technological salvationism. And what I mean by that is the view that technology will save us. That if only we can make cheaper solar panels, if only we can have more effective carbon sequestration, that just like the IT industry has expanded, that the Green Crusaders will come in and save us with technology. All of these chapters of the story are wrong, and they are causing the Earth great distress, and they're causing us great distress. This is a catastrophic story that started in the Industrial Revolution and whose time has now coming to an end, and we need to replace it with a new story. So why do I keep on going on about stories? Well, it's partly because of my own work in psychology, understanding that stories are how we make sense of the world. They tell us who we are, what's important, where we're going. A story determines how we think, how we feel, and how we act. It shapes our experience. But it is just a story. It's a worldview. It's not reality. Just as we have written this old story, we can write a new one. And the thing is, we have to change our lifestyles. As Tony will show in a minute, we are facing a crisis way worse than a pandemic, way worse than anything we've ever faced in our history. IPCC has clearly told us that we need to reduce carbon emissions by nearly 8% every year up to 2030 to keep temperatures increased below 1.5 degrees. That's the equivalent of living like we did in April at the height of the pandemic, and even less emissions than that. So we have to change our lifestyles. We have to change our economy. We have to change our politics. We have to change the whole system because the old one isn't working. Now, this is daunting. This is huge. This is staggeringly big, but it's also a wonderful, exciting opportunity to be part of what I believe is the most significant movement in history. And it's not about duty or giving things up. It's not about fear or guilt. It's about leading a healthier, a happier, and a more fulfilling life. In these webinars, we're going to show you the evidence, the proof, the tools, the knowledge, and everything you need to show exactly how you can live a better life.
Wow, that's quite a start there for that. Thank you very much, Paul. If our underlying assumption is that humans are incredibly selfish, what does that mean for the natural environment, Tony?
Yeah, well, this is the key thing, isn't it? And I want to continue this idea of the story that we tell ourselves, what it actually means. What are the repercussions? We tell ourselves this story of endless growth, of exploitation, consumption, consumerism, all that sort of thing. So we have exponential growth. It continues, growth on growth on growth. And this is actually setting us an impossible ecological trajectory. Actually, it's an impossible mathematical trajectory as well. And I want to illustrate this with a little story, really, a little analogy. I'd like you to imagine a water lily, a small water lily in the corner of a very large lake. Now, this water lily doubles in size every day. Okay, bear with me. At the end of the year, the lake is completely covered in water lilies. Okay, the question is, when was it half covered in water lilies? The answer, of course, is on day 364. It doubles again on day 365. The crowding of the lake comes that quickly. By Christmas Day, it's still about 98% open water. So what's the problem? But by 364 days, half covered, 365 days covered. If those water lilies discovered 3 more ponds, it would only last another 2 days. Now, if we turn that around to our own situation, we aim for something like a 3% growth rate. Now, 3% growth rate means we double roughly every 23 years. Let's say 30 years to allow for, efficiency improvements as well. So 30 years doubles, okay? So that means that our economic activity is twice as big after 30 years. What are the repercussions of this? What actually happens? Endless growth, endless infinite growth on a finite planet, what does it actually mean? Well, of course, we're getting climate breakdown. We have released, this is a staggering fact, we've released as much or more carbon dioxide since 1990 than we did in the whole history of the human race before 1990. That's how exponential growth works. Obvious repercussions of that, we're now getting record temperatures in the Arctic. The Arctic has been on fire. Record temperatures in Death Valley, so the Earth's highest temperature has now been recorded. Greenland ice is melting to a point of no return. The Earth has lost 28 trillion tons of ice in the last 30 years. Wildfires in California, wildfires in Australia, we know all about this. The Himalayan glaciers are melting. That'll probably wreck the water resources of a large number of people downhill from there. So, thinking of the climate, what we're doing now, human-driven climate catastrophe is bringing to an end a 10,000-year period of stable climate, which is the only period we know that actually allows agriculture and civilization. So we're bringing that period to an end, and that's the climate. We're also getting ecological breakdown as well. We are in the 6th mass extinction. We have caused loads of extinctions, up to 200 species a day. Scientists have worked out it'll now take 3 million years for the Earth to recover from the extinctions so far, and we're only at the beginning. Think of a few numbers: 75% crash in insect numbers in some places, 60% crash in vertebrate populations, and those two figures just in the last 30 years, since the 1970s. We know our soils are disappearing; they're ending up in the sea. Fish stocks are crashing worldwide. Rainforests are largely gone. The most productive land is given over to support humans. There's no land left. All of these figures are going against us. And also, these two catastrophes work together, the climate catastrophe and the ecological catastrophe. We're impacting on the living world massively and increasingly, and yet we're reducing the ability of the world to respond. And by the way, climate and ecological collapse are carrying on and accelerating while we've had our minds diverted by the COVID crisis. Okay, I want to give you a kind of optimistic view. We've been on the world, our species has been on the world for about 200,000 years. Great, 200,000 years. If I was really optimistic, I'd say we've used up half the world. Let's say that. Think of those figures I've just given you. Let's say we've used up half the world. So the question is, how long, been here 200,000 years, how long will it take to use up the other half? Well, the answer is 30 years on those growth statistics, and it's probably far, far worse. We believe in technology. Okay, let's go to some other planets. On that rate of growth, we need 3 more planets ready to be colonized by the year 2100 in order to continue our rate of growth that we're having now. So that's not really very feasible, is it? And actually, our current story, which is completely bonkers, is based on really heroic levels of wishful thinking. We've driven the Earth's life support system to the brink of collapse. It's probably far worse than using just half of it. We've got no doubling times left.
And I thought you used the word optimism a minute ago. I'm not feeling very optimistic at the moment. I know we're trying to change that story, but this continual material growth does have an effect on humans. And just even hearing stories like that, what are those effects, Paul, in your findings?
Absolutely. Well, Tony has very well laid out the extraordinary damage that we are doing to this majestic planet we live in, but we're also doing a lot of damage to ourselves. You know, this is not just an ecological crisis, a climate crisis. This is a crisis facing humanity. The point is, we built this system from the Industrial Revolution, and it raised people's standard of living, certainly to a point, but that was when there was 1 billion, 2 billion people. We're now approaching 8 billion people, and it's bursting at the seams, this system. It can't cope. So the story is harmful to nature and the climate, but it's harmful to us. Our current social, political story is profoundly flawed. We don't distribute our wealth equitably. This leads to social instability, injustice. We can see during COVID-19 that it's been the very poorest, the most vulnerable people who've suffered the highest mortality rates, who are suffering economically. You know, we pass on all our problems to the poorest of the world. And the affluent use far too much of our resources. 10% of the highest income earners are responsible for 25 to 43% of the environmental impact, whereas the bottom 10% income earners exert only 3 to 5% of the impact. So there's tremendous inequity. We consume far more than we need. We have very damaging externalities. You know, we ship out waste to China. We have people working in sweatshops in very polluted places so we can have cheap clothing. The story is discriminatory. It's a story of colonialism, of racism, of patriarchy. It's a story of disconnection from nature and from each other. And it's a dangerous story. To maintain this system, the world is spending nearly 3 trillion a year on military expenditures. Imagine what we could do with that in terms of solving the climate crisis. But it's also very harmful to our individual well-being. I think we might be materially better off in many ways, but I feel that we are emotionally and spiritually more impoverished, and we're locked into a system that's making us sick. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, anxiety, depression, loneliness are at an all-time high. Hyper-individualism, greed, inequality, competition, and overwork has crushed a lot of people's spirits. And you know, the happiest countries in the world, which are measured scientifically year after year, they all have certain things in common. And one of the most prominent is they have the smallest gap between rich and poor. So a fairer, juster, more equitable society is far better for our well-being and our happiness. Money, unfortunately, in our system has a higher value than nature, higher value than our health and well-being. Corporations have more rights than humans. And I think the American commentator Dave Ramsey put it very well. We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. Or a more spiritual explanation from Krishnamurti, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society.
Well, so that's the effect on human beings. It's quite, again, a very sobering situation that you've just described. And I wonder, Tony, if there's a different way that we can view nature too. Are we getting the story right there?
Well, yes, there certainly is a different way we can view nature, and we'll be discussing this in later webinars. But actually, we need to start off by busting a few myths. And actually, I've lived with these myths all my working life. You know, I've been patted on the head and sent into a corner because I get the story. Nature is for nature lovers. It's a lovely consumer choice. You can go and see your nature in a zoo or in a nature reserve. So nature is for nature lovers. That's one myth. The second myth is that caring for the environment, if you care for the environment, that's actually a favour to environmentalists. It's an option. You know, if you choose to do that, then you can care for the environment, and the environmentalists want us to do that, so I suppose we better do some. So caring for the environment is a favour to the environmentalists, and nature is only there as a consumer choice for nature lovers. This is bonkers. Primacy of nature actually overrides everything. We do not live on a lifeless rock, you know, on which we just sit and take what we need. We actually live on a living planet. The best way to describe our planet is as a living planet. It is actually, life itself is the source of everything we rely on. Oxygen, food, water, climate regulation we know about, disease control, carbon lockup, nutrient cycling, protection from solar radiation, all those sorts of things as well. To say nothing about the fact that contact with nature stops you going bonkers. You actually need contact with nature. Yet if we look just at Britain, we look just at the UK, these ecosystem services, as we call them, these are degrading. 30% of them are degrading, and most of the rest exist in a degraded state. So actually, this is the start of the change. Nature is not just for nature lovers. It's the basis of life and well-being for all of us. I'd like to misquote a guy called David Suzuki, who's, I think, a Canadian environmentalist. He said, some things we can't change. Some things we can't change. Things like gravity, the speed of light, and our biological nature that requires air, water, soil, and biodiversity for our health and well-being. Those sorts of things we can't change. Other things we can change. Capitalism, the economy, money, they're not forces of nature. We invented them. They are not immutable. We can change them. And actually, look at the fact that we are part of nature, not separate from nature, is one of the key principles that we're going to be looking at one of the next seminars. Another future is not only possible, it's actually vital. Indeed, I'd say it's inevitable. We're going to get there anyway. As Greta Thunberg said, change is coming, like it or not. The later we leave a voluntary change, the faster will be a crash in order to get that change. But actually, I think we need, I used the word optimistic before, changing from the lie of the past is actually a good thing. Our better nature is far better.
Yeah, thanks for that. And we've got quite a lot of questions already coming through and comments, but I'm just going to do one more little bit of the discussion about the effect of COVID on all of this thinking. And then I'm going to open it up because there's some really fascinating comments and questions coming through. But Tony, first, in your view, how does the COVID pandemic fit into this story?
Well, a big issue is the commodification of nature, seeing nature as a thing to trade. And that's what drives nature's destruction. And the destruction of nature, in turn, has made the conditions for pandemics. So COVID is the result of commodification, of trading of nature. We think of all sorts of things. Think of ecological collapse, think of factory farms, think of wildlife trade, the cause of the last pandemic. They're all the things which make us incredibly vulnerable to new pandemics. 3, 4, 5 new viruses every year are likely to be infecting us at the moment. The size of this commodification, I'll give you one statistic rather than riddle you with statistics. 96% of the mammals on Earth are either humans or our livestock. Only 4% are everything else. Only 4% of lions, tigers, mice, badgers, you name it. Only 4% of the mammals on Earth are wild mammals. 96% are either us or our livestock. There's not much room for expansion there. So, treating nature as a commodity, treating it as a thing that we can trade, is the cause of a lot of our problems. So another thing we'll be discussing in a later webinar is how we can change that from a system which commodifies and exploits and consumes nature to one which actually values it, regenerates it, and cherishes it. That's the subject for another one of our webinars. Also, we are citizens. We're not consumers. One thing we need to think about is that word consumption, the word consumer, should be an insult. We are citizens first. That'll be the subject of another seminar as well. So the later we leave voluntary change, the worse will be the crash. But change is very good for us.
So we're giving a lot of promise for later webinars, and this is our introductory webinar, obviously, so we're not going to answer everything, although we will come to the questions in a minute. Paul, can I just ask you for your take on how the COVID pandemic fits into the story that you've been painting?
Well, I don't want to say that COVID is a good thing, because for many people it has been truly appalling, and especially for the poor and vulnerable. But to the extent that it's been a wake-up call, and unfortunately a dress rehearsal for far worse things to come, hopefully it will galvanise and mobilise us into taking real action. But you see, COVID for me really illustrated the seeds for our new story. Empathy, collaboration, compassion, community. The fact we're very adaptable, very flexible, that we've appreciated our locality. We've had a new sense often of love of nature, and the joy from serving others. I think that COVID-19 highlighted our better nature, which is the name of this series of webinars. And it showed what is possible if we really cultivate and grow these seeds. I think the pandemic has also exposed the falsehood that we are selfish and only interested in our self-interest. We're not inherently selfish. It's the system, the old story, that brings out that part of us. We're complex people. We have many sub-personalities, many parts, but we live in a world where constant marketing, media, constant conditioning brings out that consumer side of us. And that's what we need to address. We're not the problem here. It's the system we've created. So what is your better nature? Well, I feel that there's two paths in very broad terms we can take in life. There's a path that most of the world is currently taking, looking at what we call the consumer self, or in some respects our lower nature, which is maximizing self-interest, looking out for ourselves. It's our ego often craving control or power or status. We all have that propensity, but we all have a very different side. And that part of us we've really seen recently, which is our compassion, our appreciation, our stewardship, our citizenship, our contribution, and our love. And this is your better nature. And the world needs our better natures to triumph. And we're going to cover and connect many different themes in the following webinars. We're going to connect your individual well-being to community and ecological well-being. We're going to look at alternative paths for our lives and for civilization, such as degrowth, ecological economics, the circular economy, donut economics, sustainable consumption, localism, genuine progress indicators as opposed to a fixation with GDP. We're going to explore in areas of particular interest to me, the double dividend, which is ways we can improve our well-being and the well-being of the environment and live more in harmony with nature. We're going to look at the science of happiness. We're going to look at voluntary simplicity, downshifting, minimalism, slow living, eco-psychology, nature therapy, and much, much more. Because we really want to appeal to your better nature. We want to cultivate your better nature. Because more than any time in history, we need this part of us to triumph. This is a part of you that feels connected to humanity and to our earth. This is a part of you that wants to take action to prevent climate breakdown and ecological collapse. And your better nature is better for us and it's better for nature. A healthy planet means healthy communities and healthy people. So we think it's time to write a new story about how we live and to act in everything we do from our better nature. And we hope that you're going to join us on this journey.
Thanks for that fantastic rallying call. And it brings me on to something that's been asked by Sam in the questions. That obviously a lot of us know each other, or we're in the same sort of groups in society. We're the converted in many cases. We've learned a lot from tonight, and we've got a lot to learn together to change things. But the real question asked Sam is how to engage the masses, not those who are already aware of issues. And how do we do that? And how do we do it in an engaging way that will make a difference? Because, you know, we haven't got a lot of time.
Shall I start and then Paul can join in?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I mean that's the key question, isn't it? That's the thing we need to be doing. I mean, before I start though, I'd say that actually I've been doing this for a little while now, and it's always been the question: how do you get to a wider audience? And what I would say, the size of the audience has got bigger. We're always thinking we're talking to the converted, which is probably true, but people are falling into that converted category far more than they were in the past. So I think there are those sorts of things, but there's, you know, it is getting bigger than it was. But I think actually the key point here is about optionalness, if that's a word. We seem to still give the idea that people need to be persuaded because it's an option. It's something we could do if we bring people around. We need to, and this is where I think Extinction Rebellion are doing well, it's not optional. We haven't got the choice. We haven't got the luxury not to be engaged in this. So I think, I'm not sure how we get this across, but for time and time again, we've made it sound far too optional. It's far too much something we can do if we want to. It's much deeper than that. So yes, we do need to, this is, you know, if it was easy, we'd already have done it. We do need to get to far bigger audiences. I see it growing, but not growing fast enough.
And Paul, what do you think?
I believe for every individual, whatever their politics, whatever their demographic, there is an access code to becoming green. For some people, it's health, a big issue. For some people, it's about your children, grandchildren. Maybe we should be talking about saving our families rather than saving the planet. Maybe that would have a more emotional appeal. For some people, it's mental health, the fact that there is very clear evidence that spending more time in nature, being part of a community, not working so hard, not doing so much shopping and getting caught in debt is clearly very good for you. So for some people, the science will be enough. For some people, fear will be enough. But I think the majority of people we need to convince is to offer them an alternative path and show them that actually it's not about wearing a hair shirt, that life, it can be far better.
So if we go from the masses to the mass planet, we have somebody in from the UN Association of Climate and Oceans. Gonzalo, do you want to ask your question about the geopolitical element to this story?
Yes, hello everyone. I represent the United Nations Association, and that's why we've got the logo there. And I throw into the mix, I mean, the issue of geopolitics, because the question is at the same time, and I totally agree with the systemic approach and all that, is in order to achieve social justice, as Paul was pointing out, how do we, as citizens of this world, let's put it that way, influence the geopolitics of the big giants that they don't want to seem to change the system, the very system that we are criticizing? Let's name them. You know, the USA, China, Russia, those are the three giants that are sustaining this global system as we currently know it. So that will be interesting. If it's serious, we can also discuss how to do it. So we are, the United Nations at the moment is in a process of a global consultation about this very issue, setting up, so maybe we can discuss what we can propose on a more global scale from the geopolitical perspective. That's a missing link, I would say, here.
Thank you for that. And obviously we'll ask our speakers to answer that if they can. And if people have ideas as well who are in the audience, because we have a very interesting audience tonight, do feel free to put them in chat or come to us with those afterwards as well. But Paul, you're leaning forward, so I'm suggesting that you probably want to get stuck in on this answer.
Well, no, I mean, it's an excellent question. And, you know, there's no question that we on our own have a certain sphere of influence. I think by working together, by working in communities, and Tony and I work very closely in our local community, by supporting initiatives, we can have an impact. By supporting parties, political parties, and voting and taking action, we can have an impact. But there's no question that, you know, the big three, and also, you know, the BRIC economies, you know, and India, they are still on that old story of material growth. I actually think, and as somebody who lived in California until 2012, this election, not just because of Trump, but because of the stand on green politics, is the most important election in our lifetime. If Joe Biden hopefully wins, he will be investing, or his administration will be investing trillions in the Green New Deal. And this concept of the Green New Deal, I think, is something which every government needs to be looking at. And it's another way of presenting the environmental argument. So it's not just about carbon emissions, it's about creating jobs. It's about doing what we did in the 1930s in the US, you know, the Roosevelt's New Deal, to actually tackle this. So I think there are a lot of different elements that we need to bring together, and we have to work at every level to change the system. There's no question of it.
And just staying with you a minute, Paul, Petra was asking, can you imagine an alternative economic system that would balance the system?
Very much so, and we're going to be exploring that in future webinars. There are a lot of very good models. I noticed somebody mentioned Donut Economics, a brilliant book by Kate Raworth, Degrowth by Tim Jackson, Naomi Klein's work. It's all very good and offers an alternative route for our economics, and the study of ecological economics explores this. But this is a very profound concept, the idea of economic degrowth. Because if you think about it, it's a lot to do with the language we use. We've been brought up to believe growth is good, recessions are bad, stagnation is bad. We've got all these emotive terms, and we need to change our language. We need to change the way we present things, because as Tony very well said with the lily analogy, we cannot continue growing under the old story. It is catastrophic.
I'm sorry, Tony, I cut you off a minute ago. Please.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, really good questions, aren't they? I mean, this is the kind of nub of the issue, and the point is, yeah, we've all got to change. That's clear. But actually, some people have got to change more than others. And actually, it's the richest people, the corporations, the people that are doing most of the damage that are going to have to change most. But we do need to work at every level. There's individual actions, there's community actions, there's working together, but there's also influencing up the tree as well. And I think we have to be careful about how this is used. Everywhere is local to somewhere. And actually, I think there's a huge agenda when it comes to localism. We need to bring things back to the local area. And actually, you know, this is where so many of us who are on the call today doing local things can feel very isolated. But no, this is about your local area. One thing that I think is going to grow in importance is actually recognizing your local community. That's what COVID has brought out, recognizing our local community, but also recognizing our local place, the environment that we share with other people, our local nature, all that sort of thing. So you know, areas like localism is going to be something in the future. But actually, we need to be careful of the con of individual action as well. Governments around the world would be very pleased if it was all on our shoulders and it was down to individual actions. The influence has to go upwards as well. We do need to actually form community voices, individual voices, but the reason for those is actually to affect at higher level. I think it's true that over 75% of the CO2 emissions in the world are caused by just 100 companies. Now, it doesn't matter how many light bulbs we change in our kitchen, it's those 100 companies that we're going to have to do something about. So it's a key question. It's something that, again, if it was easy, it would already be done, but it's something we really need to work on. And I think it's how we work, as Paul said, at every level. It doesn't just get left to the individual to do. So politicians can say, well, we would have done something, but nobody let us. We have to work at every level.
Just staying with you a minute there, Tony. Keith Collin asked a question earlier on about that CO2 that you just mentioned, because it is understood to have impacts on the virus outbreak severity. Do you think that CO2 levels are a causative factor for the current pandemic? And do you think that if the public knew this, it may be the spur to make them reconsider their carbon footprints?
Well, yeah, I saw that question as well. A very interesting observation. At the moment, I think the levels in terms of the effect of your vulnerability to a virus, I'm not sure how the science works on that. But increased CO2 does have all sorts of effects that people haven't really talked about. Apparently, it makes our brains duller. If you're living people working indoors and CO2 levels go up, we are less intelligent. It's been measured. So CO2 does have an effect. But actually, the rise of CO2 is having such catastrophic global temperature effects. I think that probably overrides the effect you get from a virus. But we haven't seen CO2 levels this high for, I think, millions of years. Humans have never experienced CO2 at this level. We've never experienced the sort of climate change at this sort of speed we're experiencing now.
So going back to our story, Annie Cousins was asking that, we know our better nature and we see a better nature in others. Our strength is combined action for change. But will we be addressing in this webinar less of what needs changing, but how? How can we change together and be united as role models for others to inspire others rather than preach to them? I suppose that everybody wants to know that how bit. But there's a lot of thinking to go on first, isn't there? And I don't know what you think. Maybe, Tony, you can kick off on this one.
Yeah, I mean, there's various levels on this, isn't there? And I think we have to work at every level. There are plenty of discussions on the technological changes that we need to have. Yeah, okay, so there's plenty of detailed, very practical things we can do with technology. That by itself certainly won't work, could be worse than useless. So technology, yes, we do need technological change. There are discussions about that, but by itself, it won't be enough. We need behavior change. We need to change what we do. But, changing what you do is affected by the values that you have. That's why we have this discussion. That's why we thought this Your Better Nature idea was a good way in. The start of all the things that matter start with your own value system. What are our values? What's the story we tell ourselves? What are we interested in? If we're competing on the same sort of frame that's set for us, can we provide more economic growth through greening the economy than through other methods? We're going to fail because actually that's the wrong frame to start with. So we need to put the frame in a different place. And that different place is actually about your better nature. It's actually about the fact that humans are hypersocial animals. We're not the selfish individuals that we're being painted. It's simply not true. It's a toxic, wrong lie. So we need to think again about, well, what are we as humans? We are hypersocial. We cherish things that we hold in common. We form society. We look after each other. So we need to start with this sort of area.
Well, Paul, Tony is starting to sound like he's been reading your books here, because this is really the essence of what you've been saying, isn't it?
Very much so. So just stepping back for a moment, 20 years ago, when I was teaching at university, one of the main areas I was teaching was behavioural change. How do we change and develop what's called pro-environmental behaviours? And I don't want to get all academic here, but the fact is, for behavioural change to work, there needs to be a whole series of conditions. Some of it is external, so peer pressure works very well. If you want to change your behaviour and everybody else in the road or your community is changing, that will have an impact. Nudging, you know, you might have heard of nudging, you know, having things like smart meters where you can actually see them, and other behavioral things we can do from that sense. But as Tony said, the real key to change comes from within. It's an inside out process. For me, when I read that book, my whole world was shattered. It was like a religious conversion. Now, I'm unusual. I'm not expecting everybody to go through that, but at different levels. The reason we're talking about stories is both consciously and unconsciously, everything you do every day is governed by a story about who you are, where you've come from, where you're going, what's important, what's not important, what's right, what's wrong. Some of that story is volitional. We've developed it ourselves. A lot of it is conditioned from our parents, from our education, from our culture, and particularly from a capitalist system and corporate system, which invades us with thousands of marketing messages every day. So we have to change that. We have to change the system to encourage a behavioral change. But some of this is outside of our control, but some of it is within. And what we're trying to do on these webinars is offer an alternative path which is supported by the science, not just the climate science, but by the science of positive psychology, by the science of well-being, by the science of values, by the science of motivation. And that there is an alternative path, which I said earlier, is a more fulfilling and pleasurable life. And we already have, you know, the happiest countries in the world are Scandinavian. And it's not because of the weather, and it's partly economic, but it's more to do with they have a much higher levels of trust, they have lower inequality, they have high levels of education, they spend more on health, they have better pensions, people pay more taxes. So we need to rethink the story at a deeper level and work at communities and government at every level.
You're talking there about education, and Mella Davidson has asked a question here. I don't know if she wants to ask it herself or explain a bit more about it, but she was saying that her son's school, they often talk about how students will become good employees. Is that part of the distorted narrative that you speak of?
Okay.
Hi. Oh, sorry,
yes.
yeah.
Mella.
It was me asking the question. I'm just saying hi, but that was my question, yeah.
Absolutely. You know, 40 odd years ago when I was at school, it was the same trajectory we were sent on, but your value in life was based on your job, on your profession, how much you earned, how you provided for your family, your house. And we lived in a culture, especially after Margaret Thatcher, when she said there's no such thing as society, there was a massive shift to individualism. Culturally, there was a massive shift towards the American culture of entrepreneurship, of self-determination, of individual growth. And we lost a lot of our community, and we need to recapture that. And in schools now, you know, the idea that to go and get a good job is what you're here to do. But we don't need more management consultants and lawyers, just or people like me, you know, who are entrepreneurs, earning lots of money. What we need is people going out there, being part of a community and being part of this movement to save ourselves, basically. And schools need to be getting this across, and we need to have a Green New Deal to provide the jobs. And and I think a lot of jobs are going to change because of COVID-19, but that's another big topic.
But Paul and Tony, what are your thoughts on those who are appealing to younger generation, people who are not in our age brackets, who are out there literally on the streets, you know, yesterday getting arrested, many of them working for Extinction Rebellion, putting this, you know, big subject very much front line for people. What do you think about the way that story is being told by Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. And you know, what we should do to stimulate the kids. Yeah, well, that's not me anyway. But actually, I think it's the other way around. The kids are getting involved themselves. They're going to be telling us how things should be. So actually, I think this is turning against us, and quite rightly. There's now a generation of people born in this century who realise what's going to happen when they're my great age. So they're seeing that they are seeing what's happening, and what they're seeing is not good. So I think it's turning the other way around. You know, the kids are starting to take control. So what we do to actually stimulate that, well, I don't know. Do I like the way that Extinction Rebellion has done things? Do I like some of the methods? Do I like the effects of what Extinction Rebellion has done? Actually, probably not. But I don't blame Extinction Rebellion. I blame the politics, the media that have made these sorts of methods absolutely inevitable in order to get voices heard. So actually, I think Extinction Rebellion and the people who are using those sorts of techniques, they're not my techniques. They're not the sorts of things I would do. But the reason that they're there is because everything else has failed. So I think, there is a new generation coming along here. There are new people coming into the fray, and they are having an effect. It's not a matter of old fogies like me saying you kids have got to do something. They're doing it anyway.
Paul, what are your thoughts on XR?
Well, I think what they're doing is critically important, because it's getting, like Greta, it's getting it onto the front pages. Yes, what really annoyed me last year was this media fixation on that one incident on a tube train and missing the whole point. But these are people like all of us here who are putting themselves at risk, who are potentially going to jail, who are taking time off and acting like concerned citizens, as we should be. These are ordinary good people going out and taking a big risk in many ways. And I admire that. And the message is essential. Imagine if we'd had a webinar like this about the virus, and Tony and I were saying a year ago, we are going to have the worst pandemic since Spanish influenza. And we were telling everybody about it, and people were going out and lying down on roads to warn people to get ready in hospitals. Now we'd be treated as heroes. And in future generations, the heroes today will be the people in XR, will be Greta, will be other people standing up, and the villains will be the fossil fuel companies, the banks who fund them. They are the modern day slave owners. I can't put it more strongly. I get more radical the older I get, because I see the damage that this system is doing.
Well, there's some fascinating comments coming in from people listening. Thank you very much for all of these. And we will try and make all of this public as well, the chat, so you can look back on it. Keith Collin is saying our laws and our legal structures are all built around the military. Our courts represent ships with docks, and our businesses are named companies. Schools teach conformity in order to effectively become part of a company. And Anne Stewart says the problem is the richest sections of society have the most to lose in their terms. So they have a lot of political and lobbying power to protect their privileged position, which I think, Paul, was what you were saying earlier. But Petra's talked about Brighton and Hove, talking about new universal income scheme, which, if it was properly thought through and implemented, could make a massive difference. So there's innovation out there. But Mike Tristram is asking, how can we make our politicians vie with another to be seen to be the party appealing to and delivering our better nature?
Yes, that's a good one as well, isn't it? Because if you meet politicians, I actually quite like most of the politicians I've met. I think they do have the kind of public service ethic, but they do try to be everybody's friend. And so we need to use that. And there are more and more politicians who are trying to pretend, maybe trying to actually be environmentally friendly. So I think we need them to get into a position where they are vying with each other for being most green. Now, the key thing here is that it won't just happen by us hoping for it. It's in the same category as with local district councillors, who again I've actually met, and I'm quite impressed with them. I think they're rather good. But the point is, they need to be lobbied. They actually want to be lobbied. Good ones want to be lobbied. They want to know what people think and what they actually want to achieve, and they're responding to what they think their electorate wants, which is what they're there to do, really. So if they think their electorate wants to have lots of stuff and they don't care about the environment, then that's what they're going to promote. But actually, if they start to get more letters from people saying, actually, we got enough stuff, we don't want more televisions, but we do want to walk in the countryside, we do want to have kids that might survive, then actually they will respond again. And I've been, reasonably, is impressed the right word? I don't know, but cheered up by some of the conversations I've had with politicians who actually say, well, yeah, we do want to be lobbied, really. So that's our job. And I think the more that we do that, the better.
And I suppose the way you tell the story, Paul, Camilla's just asked, is it also about making change in people's interests and not to deal with fear? So it's which aspect of the story you use to try and change behaviour?
Yeah, it's a very good question. What we find from research into behavioural change in the environment is that fear is a very poor motivator. It can work for a limited time, it can work in emergencies, but if we're looking at long-term behavioural change, it needs to be positive. It needs to be something that can be maintained and built and reinforced. And a lot of what we're trying to do in Your Better Nature, what I do in my work of greening Stenning in our local area, is trying to create a positive vision of how life can actually be better. You know, I keep on coming back to this because all the pieces of the jigsaw are there in terms of how life could be better if we live more simply. You know, I really recommend anyone to read Dwayne Elgin's book, Voluntary Simplicity, the latest version in particular. I got to know Dwayne in California. He's a wonderful man. And that's a brilliant manifesto for how we can all live and be outwardly simple but inwardly rich, a beautiful phrase he uses. And that's at the essence of Your Better Nature, is cultivating that inward richness that we all have.
Well, on that note, we are actually virtually out of time, and we are going to need to wrap up in a minute. We've got one huge question from Nicola Peel, and it's wonderful to have you back in the UK, Nicola, about global governance. And I'm assuming that we're going to move that into one of our 4 webinars to come.
We are. I mean, the concept of citizenship and citizenship of the world is something very strong. My late father was a socialist, and his great goal was to have and I'm not just saying this, but the UN members here, was to have a strong United Nations, was to have, you know, to think of ourselves as citizen of the world. And I used to have that on my door at university, and I've always believed in that as a very profound concept. We need to think as a species now.
And Tony, what are you looking forward to over our next seminars, particularly? What aspects of some of the questions that are coming through, what are you sort of thinking, yeah, I know we're going to answer that soon?
Yeah, it's delving into some of these things because many have talked around these things, but actually I think we're at a stage in history where there are plenty of precedents set, there are plenty of alternative models, there are things which have been tried and which have worked. So I think we're at a time now where this discussion needs to move on. It's not just about, you know, what we do, it's about how we think, what sort of story we tell ourselves. And it's happened before, let's say that now. You know, we've been here for 200,000 years, and we've really only messed up this badly for the last 10,000. Agriculture was probably a bad idea. So now we're coming to the end of that period. We need to think, well, what do we do now? How do we actually get back to something which, and the principles of donut economics, we need to get above a kind of social threshold, so everybody's actually well looked after, but we can only be within an environmental limit. So the principles of that is what we need to be talking about. So yeah, I think, especially with all the comments that are coming in, I think there's plenty of fertile ground for discussion.
Well, we certainly will be doing a lot more discussion very soon. But just before we go, I want to remind you of a couple of issues that have come out of tonight's discussion. This was only an introduction to Our Human Story Needs Rewriting. In Paul's latest book, he said, when you change your story, you change your life. And I hope that there's been some life challenges to you in some of the discussions tonight, because our current story is definitely toxic, and to create a new story is life affirming. And we have to start with ourselves, and we have to start with how we talk about the humanity and our humanity and the planet first. There's some heavier reading for you if you wish to delve into the IPBES science, looking at the species threatened with extinction. We are going to be putting information like this on all of our social media sites and giving it to you in a link afterwards. But if you want a bit of a lighter look at the story that we've been talking about, then have a look at tomfoolery on YouTube. And again, we'll be sending you that link. If we just look forward now, we are going to be on at 7 o'clock for every Wednesday in September. So we have 4 more webinars, and we will be discussing 4 main principles that we want to build into this new story. So we hope together we'll create a new story. And next week we'll be looking at how we are part of nature and we're not separate from it. So please do book your place via Eventbrite. You can stay in touch with us by email. We've got a YouTube channel, which hopefully this will find its way onto. Facebook will be our main place where we'll be giving lots of links and information, and there are the Twitter addresses for Tony and Paul, so they can please carry on the conversation. Let's just see who's on here still, and I'm just going to come into a gallery view so we can see everybody who's still here. Thank you. Do unmute and do whatever you want so we can all say hello to each other for a brief moment at least. I'm very grateful to Tony and to Paul, obviously, for all the thought-provoking discussion that they've led with, and also to Viv, who's been sweating it out of the engine house there, making sure all of this works smoothly. And we owe a great deal of thanks to her. But most of all to you guys, because you've been a fantastic audience, really listening and taking part and coming up with great ideas. And we'd love you to stay on this journey with us. It's going to be an interesting one, and we hope you'll be able to continue to contribute to it. But that is all for tonight, and we'll be back next. Thank you, Kim. We'll be back next week at 7. Thank you.